If you are new to the wonderful community and you aren't already following us on socials, then this is where you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at She's Wonderful. We have a bunch of interesting events coming up in July, and they're great if you want to upskill, learn new skills with respect to content creation, or just simply want to be connected to a network of travel-loving women. It's a great community, and I've enjoyed being a part of it. For every paid membership, a wonderful scholarship goes to a woman in need. And it's an excellent place to just basically share travel tips and, talk about certain destinations and traveling to different places, things like solo travel. I've also enjoyed being part of the community because I have learned a lot about, professional development as a content creator and as a travel writer. And thank you to all of you for being here. The topic of today's presentation is something that I am very, very passionate about. Also, I will be sharing the link to join the wonderful community in the chat at the end of this presentation. Thank you to our brand partners without whom we couldn't do such amazing events. And if this is the first time that you've joined a session with me, then this is a little bit about me. My name is Natasha Amar, and I am a travel blogger and a freelance travel writer and photographer. You can find me on my blog, thebohochica.com, and on Instagram at thebohochica. My work has appeared in Lonely Planet, National Geographic Travel, UK, Afar magazine, Insider Travel, and a bunch of different in-flight magazines. I started off writing about travel, but now I also write about food, culture, people, and mental health. I am a third culture kid, and I'm Indian based in Dubai. And I'm someone who was born in the desert, but I have this deep love of the Arctic and cold, remote places. And just feel free to let me know where you're joining in from today, and anything that you want to share about yourself. Just feel free to write it in the chat. We are still waiting for a few more people to join. Okay, so today's session, we'll talk about the status quo of travel content and 5 easy ways to create content that's responsible. And towards the end, hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A. One of the things I realized that when we talk about creating, creating travel content, whether that's videos or photos or blog posts, or even if it's freelance writing, when we think about responsible travel content, it can seem like it's very serious. And sometimes it feels very overwhelming because there's a bunch of different things that you need to think about. And sometimes it doesn't come to us naturally. So before I begin this presentation, I'm just going to put it out there that there's a bunch of things I've done over my 7-8 year career that I actually cringe at now. So it's like I have made a lot of mistakes and I have learned from them. So this presentation is not about, shaming anyone or shaming any kind of travel content. It's just about me having learned and sort of looking back now, seeing the mistakes that I've made and just wanting to share what I've learned and the things that I do that now make me feel a little bit better about the kind of stories I'm writing or, the kind of content I'm creating. At any point in time, if there's something that you would like to add, just feel free to unmute yourself or to write in the chat. I mean, I think it's just great if we can all learn from each other. So what travel content looks like today? Travel is transformative, it is inspiring, but when you look at so much of travel content today, you see that it is promoting places that are already popular. This could be cities, This could be entire countries, or it could be a certain attraction, a certain temple in Indonesia, or a certain viewpoint in Iceland, or a certain waterfall. So a lot of travel content today is just promoting already popular places. And obviously that leads to over tourism. We've all seen photos of those queues where everybody's, getting in queue to take that one picture at that one waterfall, and Instagram versus reality. We've all seen that. A lot of content today encourages seeing, photographing and documenting, but not listening. So it reduces the whole travel experience to something that you consume. So it's something that you need to cover, you need to make a reel about, you need to take pictures of, you need to write about it. And that is all from your point of view or from the visitor's point of view. And not all of it is about listening to what that destination needs or what the people from that place need. A lot of travel content today, including like the articles that you might read in any publication, any travel magazine, centers the visitor, not the host communities. So it's always about saying like the tourist or the visitor like is at the center of it, like everything is meant to serve them, and that's a problem. A lot of travel content today focuses on the costs of experiences instead of value. So when we talk about destinations being cheap, it sort of discounts or does not consider a lot of the other aspects other than the cost of, whatever, like hotels or experiences of food. There's a lot more that you can talk about, a lot more to write about, and a lot more to the entire story of a certain destination than just how much things cost. A lot of travel today presents destinations through rose-colored glasses without acknowledging conflicted histories and origins. We get like really in the habit of making things very comfortable and easily digestible, that we don't want to go to or we don't want to explore these conflicted histories and origins through our work. And a lot of travel content today does not add anything new or original to the conversation. Maybe it's a story that you've read before, just the words were different, but the narrative is the same. Or it's the kind of video that you've seen 100 times before, and it's not adding anything new to the conversation. So why is it like that? When most travel content creators or travel writers that I know, they are truly passionate about travel, including me. I'm very passionate about travel. And sometimes I fall short of words to describe the kind of, transformative experiences I'm having or what I'm feeling. But why is it that might not always come across in the content that I'm creating? Why doesn't that magic of travel transcend the experience that I'm having and actually make it into my content or into my stories? And I've thought about this a lot. And what I did was to look within why my stories were not everything that I wanted them to be or everything they could be. And I realized that when, as creators or as writers, we see what works and we do more of the same, that's not something that is, that's not something that I'm ashamed of, because when I was starting out and I was trying to make it as a professional content creator and a freelance travel writer, I would obviously look at what was being published, what kind of content was doing well, and I was trying to replicate that. Because when you have something that works, when you have a formula, the easiest way for, if you're new or if you're trying to develop your professional skill or the craft, get better at the craft, the first thing you would do is see what is out there and try to do more of the same. And there's nothing wrong in that, except that we didn't already have content that was responsible enough. There are also representation gaps in travel media. So the reason you see the same kind of stories that are not diverse enough, that are not deep enough, is because a lot of the people that are making these decisions of what content does well or gets published, well, simply put, there's not enough diversity there. There's also the fear of discomfort and fear of failure and fear of vulnerability. To say that we can do better, we can have more responsible travel stories, that means acknowledging that what we are doing right now is not enough, that we don't know everything, or we're not doing everything 100% correct. That makes us look vulnerable. It is very uncomfortable to say that. And when I look back at some of my stories, I cringe at the words I've used, and I'm like, did I really do that? But I'm supposed to be good at this. So that makes me uncomfortable. But we have to sort of get past that and try to learn. Even for those of us who've been doing this for many years, writing travel stories or creating content, I think it's very important to keep learning, and not be afraid of that discomfort. We also have this desire as travel content creators to keep things light and bright. So I've often, a lot of people say, and I respect that viewpoint, that I don't want to talk about anything that's political or dark, or I don't want to I don't want to go there. My content is supposed to make people feel good or feel happy. It's just about, traveling and travel inspiration and keeping things light and bright. But everything that we do, the story we tell, the words that we use to tell that story, the sources that we're using, all of those things together are making a statement about that place. That by itself becomes you participating in something that could be political or that is political. Another reason is that we don't realize when we're judging other cultures. Sometimes we're looking through a westernized lens. We are so used to seeing things in the context of what we know that anything that's different might come across as bizarre or strange, or thinking of that as exotic. That is all of that contributes to othering different cultures and not taking the time to understand them or to know about them, just saying that this is too different for me and that therefore it is wrong. Sometimes our content is so focused on serving only people like us that we forget that in the age of the internet, where all of our content is online, it could be reaching people who are not like us. So it only serves us well to have more nuanced, rounded stories than something that just comes from one myopic point of view. How do we ensure that we are covering destinations responsibly? Now, every time that I'm trying to make sure that what I'm writing is something that I'm good enough to write about, or I know enough to write about, this is sort of a checklist that I use. Would someone living in the destination find this content or story irritating or offensive? This has happened to me a lot in terms of me reading stories written by other journalists about Dubai. Dubai is a city where I was born and raised, and I still live here. So I definitely have very strong roots here, a very strong connection. And sometimes I will read a story by someone who visited for 4 days, and I will be very annoyed, very irritated, because it feels like they didn't take the time to get to know the destination. And that article is basically them judging the destination or the city on the basis of 4 days. So every time I'm writing about a different destination or a place, I ask myself, would someone else living there find the story irritating or offensive? Do I know enough to write about this? Now, sometimes we simply do not know enough to write about a topic. That does not mean that we can absolutely not write about it. There are ways to work around this. So if you don't know enough, you can use local sources. And we will talk about this further in the presentation. But you need to ask yourself this question. This is what I believe. Every single time when you're writing about something with authority, or you claim to be the authority, or you've done your research, you need to know you need to simply know for sure if you know enough to write about this using your own research or your experience, or do you need to dig deeper and find a local source? Does this story reinforce stereotypes about the place, people, or culture? If you find that the story that you're writing just basically reaffirms a stereotype which is commonly held or widely believed, or something that's already written about in the media in a certain way, then you need to probably dig deeper, look closer, and see if you can find something else. Because whenever you see, or whenever, in my experience, whenever there is one dominant narrative of a place or a city or an experience, it's usually incomplete. If there's just one story, and if you keep hearing that one story, for example, since I do write about Dubai a lot as a local expert, I hear this a lot. Dubai is like Las Vegas, and Dubai is like Las Vegas, Dubai is like Las Vegas. Now, that at one point was the dominant narrative, and I kept hearing that over and over. And it was funny because it was like one magazine that published it, and then another one, and then another one. And that told me that the writers over there, or the journalists, they were being lazy. They weren't trying to find Dubai outside of that narrative, which I know, and which in my experience really truly exists. Another thing to ask yourself is, am I generalizing without being aware of my own privileges and or biases? Am I adding anything new to the conversation? Now, I understand it's not always possible to add something new to the conversation. It doesn't have to be something really big or really deep. Sometimes it can be a small, a really small detail that maybe nobody else noticed or covered or paid attention to. Even a small detail that sort of deviates from that dominant narrative is actually making your article or your piece of content richer. Now, let's talk about the 5 easy ways that you can use to ensure that your content or your travel story is more responsible. Amplify local voices. So coming back to in the previous slide, where if you feel that you don't know enough about a topic, but it's really interesting to you, maybe an example of that for me was when I traveled to Greenland, and I was very interested in what was the local food in Greenland, and like the traditional Inuit cuisine. But I simply didn't know enough. And I visited there for a few days, and I did taste the cuisine, but it was still not enough for me to write about as an expert, because I'm not an expert, right? So I decided to interview the Inuit people who were introducing me to that food and get their stories. I could use my platform and I could use my story to amplify local voices. So that's a great way when you feel that it's impossible for you to know everything about a certain topic, because obviously when we're traveling, somewhere, it's just for a few days or even for a few weeks, you don't know enough. That's an excellent reason to actually find local voices and amplify them, use them as sources in your story, in your content. You don't need to speak for the people of a certain place or the culture of a certain place. You can let them do the talking and just use your story as a platform. So talk to people. If you find yourself on organized tours, ask questions. A lot of the tours are, conducted by locals, like walking tours of cities. And usually the people on these tours, they're quite passionate about, about the subject or about their city or about, showing you one aspect, like maybe markets in a certain city. And they are usually really great sources. They're quite knowledgeable. It is okay to find local subject matter experts to interview. So if you're talking about the music scene or you're talking about the food scene in a certain city, find musicians, find local chefs, and interview them. Ask them, can I have a bit of your time? Can we talk about this topic? And it's okay to actually ask permission, prepare some questions, and go and speak to them, because these are things that will actually make your story so much more richer than just research or just what you've experienced. Look within your networks. As travel content creators, our networks are quite rich. We all have people that we've met in certain cities, people that have traveled to certain cities. So reach out within your networks and ask, is there a local in this destination that I could talk to? Is there somebody that I could meet for coffee and maybe talk about their city? these are all things that I've done, from the early days since I started traveling. And when I, wanted to be, when I was an aspiring travel writer. So even before I had assignments or commissions, I would actually, ask to meet people and maybe, take them out for a coffee and just, sort of interview them so that when the time came to write a story about a certain topic that I was interested in writing about, then I would have, a source, I would have good material. It's important when you're doing this to listen with an open mind, to be considerate of how you ask questions. In my experience, you can basically get away with asking any kind of question about anything, whether that's about race or politics, if you ask it in a way that comes across as considerate and respectful. Take notes. I always bring a notebook with me, and I always have my phone. So I will, use a voice recorder or, take a video on my phone with permission. And so I have all this information. It's very important to do that because you might think that you would remember a detail, but having quotes like, word for word quotes, that's invaluable. Always make sure that you note down names of the people that you speak with. So if you're talking to a guide or a local expert, make sure you get their full name. Always ask for permission, that would it be okay for me to quote you in a story about that I might write about this, and use this material. That it's just definitely more professional even to have these kind of sources. The second thing you can do is look beyond popular destinations. If you've seen a piece of content, a video, or a story 100 times before, there are still things that you can do that make your content stand out and also make your content more responsible. Maybe you could cover a second city or a small town close to a famous place. So maybe you've heard about this. Maybe, it's obviously easier. A lot of us find ourselves traveling to destinations that are very popular or that have over tourism because it's usually easier to fly there, or maybe there are direct connections. But if you feel that it's already been written about 100 times, everybody's written about it, there are so many blog posts about it, so many videos about it, maybe you could cover a second city or a small town that is a popular day trip from there. Or maybe it's not so popular right now, but you went on this day trip and you thought it was amazing. That's a great way for you to actually direct your audience to, like, here, this is the obvious destination you fly into, but if you want to do a day trip and where you want to see something that not everyone sees, then this is a great second city or a small town to visit. Find offbeat, alternative, under the radar experiences. So if you know that these 10 attractions in a certain city, that's where everyone goes, maybe you could try some different kind of tour, maybe a street art tour that nobody's, that's not as popular, and maybe you could write about that. You could do a deep dive on one interesting aspect. So maybe everybody does these 3 luxury experiences in a particular city. Maybe you found maybe you found a very interesting cooking class, or you found a very interesting cycling trip in the countryside, something like that. So that's just one. Maybe it doesn't have to cater to everyone. It doesn't have to be like 50 or 60 of the top things to do in this particular city, but it's just one interesting aspect which is not obvious, which is not talked about enough. You could also promote travel to that destination in a different way. So if everybody's visiting on a cruise, maybe you talk about visiting this destination or exploring it by e-bike. That's a different way. It's still a famous destination, but the way you're writing about it is different from how it's normally written about. Some practical tips for doing this: do a lot of research. Again, reach out to people in your networks. The wonderful community is a great place to ask about travel tips. So if you're traveling to a destination, it's a great place to say, and ask other travel loving women if they've done something different, something unique, if they've experienced that destination in a different way. You can, as a travel content creator or as travel media, you can also reach out to tourism boards and destination marketing organizations and agencies, and you can ask them, what are the new products that you're offering? Are there any new tours that I can experience? Are there any new, something that's not been written about? And they will be usually more than happy to point you in the right direction. Keep an eye on new trends in travel. What I mean is that sometimes you might notice that, for example, these days there's a lot of emphasis or a lot of attention on train travel. And maybe you're visiting, let's say you're visiting West Sweden, and a lot has been written about hiking in West Sweden. So you want your content to stand out. So you might say, okay, train travel is something that's very popular these days. Is it possible to travel in West Sweden by train? And then you might find that, yes, there's actually, they have this new initiative where you can still go hiking, but you can actually get to each of the hiking routes through a network of trains, or through like a sort of train itinerary by train. And that's just like you taking this new trend and applying it to this destination. Talk to locals at your hotel, guest house, Airbnb, to guides, and ask them what are the challenges that they are facing in that destination. And usually they will tell you something like, we don't like this kind of tourism, or we don't like cruise tourism because this is how it strains our resources. And that's where you will get ideas for what not to write about and what to focus on instead. Taking off the rose-colored glasses, that's another way to make sure that your content is not overly, it is not just overly positive, or it's not overly negative, or it's not just generalizing about places. Sometimes we are so keen on keeping things light and bright that we exaggerate, we skip important facts, or we gloss over them. What if we were honest? So it's important. You don't always have to write about it, but it's important to be aware of dark and conflicted histories and politics, so that when you are actually writing a story or creating a piece of content, you don't say something that's totally tone deaf or insensitive. It's important to be aware of oppressive systems, of histories which are intertwined with colonialism and racism. It's very important to be aware of socioeconomic truths. It's okay if your work or if your story does not have all the answers. It's okay to ask questions. There's nothing wrong with mentioning facts. It's okay that you want to keep things light and bright, but it's important to sometimes mention facts, again, so that you don't create unrealistic expectations. Don't oversimplify or generalize, and don't engage in clickbaity tactics. One example of this, I have seen a lot of stories about certain destinations where a content creator would make videos and say, this destination, if you're a visitor or a tourist, you don't need to pay any money. People are just giving me things for free, and everybody's so nice. And if you're a visitor here or an outsider, you don't need to pay for anything, and everything is free. And in my opinion, those stories come across as very, they really oversimplify and they generalize, and that is not accurate. Because sometimes what happens is that the content creator who's making these kind of videos, they would go to, maybe let's say it's a South Asian destination, a country. They would go to a small town or a village where people aren't used to seeing white people with cameras, and they're really proud of that. They're really proud that a celebrity or a content creator has come to that destination. So they would be really warm, and they would be like, yes, okay, everything is for free, you don't need to pay at the market, here's some free food or whatever. But that's not the experience that a normal tourist, a regular tourist who is not a content creator or a travel blogger would get. That is not an experience that a brown or a person of color would get as a visitor. So it's very important to not show things like, it's very important to have that nuance. And if it's great if you as a content creator get treated that way, that's really nice. You feel really great, and you want to share that experience. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that you got that experience for a certain reason, but that should not be the expectation. That is not the norm. That's the exception. Some practical tips for taking off the rose-colored glasses: be willing to break the bubble. Now, very often tourism exists in this bubble. So the experience of the tourist in a certain city is restricted to this comfort zone, right? You have the hotel, you have the attractions, you have the tour, and when you're short on time, rarely ever would you get out of that tourism bubble and explore on a deeper level what life is like there, or like I said, the socioeconomic truths or the conflicted histories. And what that comes across in your story is that it's a very limited, very like again, a rose-colored story told through rose-colored glasses. If you want your content to be more responsible, you should be willing to break the bubble. You don't have to go deep. You probably don't have the time. But again, if you make the time to speak to some locals, you'll get a more rounded perspective, or more honest, more grounded perspective of what it actually is like in that destination, what their history is, what their reality is, not just what has been made or created for tourists. It's important to be comfortable with the discomfort. When you write about serious things, or when you write about socioeconomic truths or colonialism or racism in a certain destination, that's uncomfortable, right? Because it's so easy to write nice things and safe things. But it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay for your work to ask questions or to raise questions. It's okay to expect and accept discussion and debate. Anyone reading that piece, there might be some people who would say, I don't agree with you. I think that, I had a really great experience. And there would be someone who will say, I do agree with you. So it's okay for your work to sort of spark those conversations. Be willing to create something or write a story that is not about virality or about top 10 or about just being extremely popular because of how positive it is. And when you're writing for publications, if you have freelance assignments or commissions, and if you find yourself writing about these topics or acknowledging facts, don't fear on pushing back with editors nicely. Sometimes editors they might want to take out all the substance from your story. And it's okay to say, go back to them and say that I added this because I thought that it would give a more, more complete or more multifaceted image of this destination instead of what is already written about. And I have local sources to back up this, this aspect that I'm writing about. So it's okay to push back on editors. Please let me know in the chat if you would like to add something, if you'd like to share any of your own experiences, or if you're following, if this is not too fast. All right. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Brittany. We're almost towards the end of the presentation, but this one is really my favorite. Choose your words carefully. Words have power, and sometimes our intentions don't match up with the words or the language, don't necessarily match up with the words or language that we're using to write our travel stories or our articles. It's a good idea to check if we are reinforcing stereotypes about cultures, genders, bodies, religions, race, or nationalities. If our words or our language is centering the tourist at the cost of the local, if we are creating unrealistic expectations, sort of like the previous example when we talk about places as being cheap, or everything's for free, everything's so nice, or things like everybody's so happy in this village or in this town, everybody's really happy. these are all of these things create unrealistic expectations. If our words or language can be triggering or disrespectful, it's also very important to ensure that the names that we are using to refer to places and people are names that, again, they're not triggering, they're not disrespectful. They are names that they would choose to refer to themselves. It's also important for our words to be specific and not assume monoliths. Um, like sometimes, and I'll be the first to admit, again, I have done all of these things. I'm guilty of all of these, of using words that reinforce stereotypes, or making monoliths out of things or cultures that are quite diverse. So one of them, for example, is Arabia. I came across that a lot when I was learning and when I was trying to, build my own skills as a writer. And I've used that too. And now, me living in Dubai, I know that there's no such thing as Arabia. In the Middle East, we have many different countries, many different cities, and there's a lot of diversity. And each of these cities, each of these countries are very different in terms of the culture, in terms of the food. Sometimes the language is different as well. So when you say Arabia, it doesn't really mean anything. There is no region as Arabia. There's different countries in the Middle East, and they're very, very different in terms of in terms of cultures. So I should have known better, but back then I didn't. So that's an example of using words and making monoliths when there are none. It's very important you think about the language around travel. Now, if you think about it, a lot of the language around travel has roots in colonialism. It has roots in those days when a lot of these colonial, powers would send sailors or navigators to go and find or discover new lands and claim them as their own. So a lot of the language today that we have, where we say that we are conquering mountains or we are discovering places, all of these ideas of how we talk about travel, they have roots in colonialism. So it's important to think about it. And honestly, like the way I think about it, we don't really conquer mountains, we don't really discover places, because those mountains and those cities have always been there. And before we got there, there were people who went there were people who lived there. So we've not conquered anything and we've not discovered anything. Those places have existed, and there have been cultures that have lived there, and there's this whole history that existed before we got there. So it's important to think about the language around travel and to try to make an intentional shift from it. One example, why should people everywhere speak English? And even now, a lot of travel articles will say that this destination is great because everybody speaks English, or avoid this destination because you might have difficulty getting around because not everyone speaks English. Now, again, that's a very limited way of, or very short-sighted way of looking at the big picture. Like, there is no need for people everywhere to speak English. And by saying that a certain destination is good or not good, or it's good to go there or not, because depending on whether or not people speak English, that's again us trying to serve a certain audience, which is only an English speaking audience, and make things comfortable for them. Now, in my experience, even in places where people do not speak English, most people will try to help a visitor or a tourist. They'll try to find someone who speaks English, or you might have to use Google Translate, or you might have to use your hands. But the point is that you would get the help that you need as a visitor, and it has very little to do with speaking English. So study your word choices, dive into why you chose them, and can you do better? The names that we use have implications. What are the origins of these names? So if you find yourself referring to places with colonial names or old names, even after the countries or the regions or the cities have changed their names, or if you're referring to a group of people with old, again, names that have roots in colonialism, then make sure that you don't do that. The best thing to do is ask locals, be aware, and make sure that the names that you use are not disrespectful, and they are names that people and places would use to refer to themselves. It's important to acknowledge diversity, complexity, intersectionality, and modernization. One of the words, when I talk about modernization, one of the words that can be really loaded with meaning or loaded with assumptions is authentic or authenticity. Uh, One example of that is that a lot of people visit Dubai and say, I did not find anything authentic. I did not find any authenticity. It's all very fake. And again, that's a very limited viewpoint because the city is relatively new. Uh, there's not a lot of ancient history with a lot of churches or old museums or anything like that. The story of this city, the authentic story of this city, is intertwined with modernization. So somebody visiting and saying that I did not find anything authentic is maybe trying to say that I expected it was going to be caravan of camels in the desert, but instead there are all these skyscrapers, and that does not fit with my idea of what I think the Arab world is. Again, that is your idea, but that's not necessarily the story that the city chooses for itself. And we need to understand that authenticity can mean different things to different people. It does not necessarily mean old or a lot of history. I read this in The Atlantic the other day. Language is powerful and contagious, and it really, really stuck with me. The way we talk about things, about places, about people, and the way we talk about it more and more, that becomes the conversation or the narrative of that place. It is in that, in effect, language is powerful and it is contagious. It's how we begin to talk about it, and it's how we start thinking about it. And then that becomes the way everybody's thinking about a certain place. So it's especially important to look deeply and closely at what words we're using and in what context. Again, talking about places as cheap, we covered that before, and also somewhere to do in X day. So when you say that this is a great city, you can do it in 4 days or do it in 2 days, that's again reducing that place, the complexity of its culture, the many things to do, the many experiences, to something that you can just just do in X days. So I think it's a better way. There are ways to think about it, or there are ways to write about it with a little bit more nuance and depth than just reducing something to somewhere you can just do in X number of days. Some words to think about when in travel writing. If you find yourself using these words, it's important to think about whether you could do better than these words, and in what context. What do you mean when you're using these words? Authentic, we covered that. Colonial. Now, I am guilty of actually describing architecture with colonial charm. And now that I think about it, and now that I know better and I've learned, there's nothing charming about colonial, to describe colonial architecture with colonial charm. It's sort of saying, it wasn't like colonialism wasn't meant to be charming. Maybe it's a great building, maybe it's beautiful architecture, but colonial and charm, those two words, like now that I think about it, there's something seriously wrong about saying that, or describing architecture in that way without without actually writing about what colonialism did or how it destroyed the cultural fabric of that place. Some other words, Oriental. Again, I'm never very sure what it means, but I am guilty of having used this word in the past. It's also really lazy to just say Oriental, like it's not specific. It doesn't tell me anything about where it's from. The word exotic, again, what comes across as exotic to one culture might not be exotic to another culture. So sometimes you might hear about spicy food or food from a certain, maybe from a country in Asia being written about as exotic, or the ingredients in this dish are exotic. But maybe they're not exotic. Maybe in that part of the world or to certain cultures, that's just regular ingredients. So sometimes when we use exotic, it just implies this whole othering, this whole different, so different that it has to be remarked upon. So again, that's a very lazy way of describing things. Some other words, conquer, discover, wilderness, tribe Instagrammable. Now, wilderness, I used to think that wilderness was fine. And I used this word many times without a second thought to what it could mean. When I traveled to Arctic Sweden, and that is the land of the Sapmi indigenous people, a lot of them told me that they didn't like it when their region was written about as wilderness, when travel writers referred to those lands in Arctic Sweden and in a lot of these countries in the Nordic, where that is home to the Sami indigenous people. And they said they didn't like it when it was written about as wilderness because it implied that there was nothing that existed there before somebody came from the West and found or discovered that land. And they said that they've been there, and their generations of Sami people have been there for thousands of years. So they weren't happy with that land being described as wilderness, even though it's remote, even though it's not like the population is not very dense, but they didn't like that it was being described as wilderness. Again, Instagrammable. Again, I have also used this word many times, but when we say something is Instagrammable, it reduces it to something that is a backdrop for a good picture. And it's, again, there's so much more to a place than just being Instagrammable. Consider nuance. Most things are not black or white. Instead of, we're so used to saying, I like this and I don't like this, which is okay. But then we back it up with saying, because this is right or this is wrong. And our understanding of different cultures, of different traditions or cultural practices or kinds of food, all of that is so colored by our own, set of values, our own experiences, where we are from, our privileges, our biases, that sometimes it's not even about being right or wrong. It's just different. So it's very important to make sure in your writing that you aren't looking at the world through a westernized lens and then deciding something is right or wrong. It's important to let people and places tell you their stories. You can maybe say that this is not for me, or I personally cannot, it does not match with my value system, but that is not a judgment on this particular aspect of culture, whether it's food or certain kinds of meat that are being eaten in certain cultures. It's not a judgment on that being right or wrong. It's just not something that I can do because for whatever, my system, my values or my belief system, if I stay true to that, then I cannot do this, but that doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's okay to look at multiple sides of a story and agree with none of them, but still share what you've learned. Like most meaningful travel, the best stories are a journey of listening, learning, and letting people and places surprise us. And now I know that we all, as people who are in travel, creating content about travel, writing travel stories, we do think of ourselves as experts, as the authority on travel, which is true, which is great. But that doesn't mean that we know everything. And it's okay for our work to acknowledge that a big part of being an expert on travel or writing about travel, being a content creator or a travel journalist is learning. A big part of our work is to learn and to listen to people and places and to help share the stories that might not be the dominant narrative or the popular story which is being told about them. And that only comes when we remind ourselves that there's a lot that I don't know, and there's a lot that I need to learn, and that my work needs to explore. I'm going to share these resources that are excellent resources to think about or to use when you're thinking about making your travel content more responsible. That's the wonderful anti-oppression toolkit. I've just shared it in the chat. And this is a very interesting article from Fodor's Travel that explores these problematic words and the language around travel. Some of those we've discussed in the presentation today, but I do recommend taking the time to read these two articles, these two resources, and both from the one from in the wonderful community and also from Four Doors, that will maybe hopefully make you think with a fresh perspective about the language around travel, what words you're using, and how, what kind of stories you're choosing to tell through your articles or through your content. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Oh, so the second link, okay. I think, okay, I'm going to share, if you're, yeah, I guess I actually thought that maybe the wonderful one is, it's for everybody, but I will, for $4, okay, it's just maybe the link when I paste it, but I'm going to share it again in the chat in a minute. I'm going to just do it right away. Maybe, yes, I think I've shared the Fedor's link right now. So I think this should work. That's a good place to start to begin, to think about which words and the language around travel. And if you're part of the wonderful community, then I suppose you can access the travel equity, the resource, which is the wonderful anti-oppression kit. And I think that's an excellent resource to get a quick overview of how to make your travel content more responsible. If you'd like to get in touch with me for a private writing mentorship session, I work with writers one-on-one, whether that's about how to write better for your own travel blog, or whether you want to pitch stories to travel publications, or whether you want to even write about food or hotels, personalities as a freelance writer. You can find me on my blog, thebohochika.com, on Instagram at thebohochika. Please feel free also to connect with me on LinkedIn, or if you want to reach out to me via email just to stay in touch, you're most welcome to do that. I will also share the link to join the wonderful community. That's a link that you can use to join the wonderful community if you're new to it, if you want to explore what it's all about. And we have a few minutes if you want to ask any questions about the things that we discussed, or if there's anything that you would like to share about the topic, you're most welcome to write in the chat or unmute yourself and just ask away. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed the session, Jan. And I'm also actually curious if there's any one aspect of writing responsible travel stories that feels overwhelming, or if there's anything that you wondered about, but maybe you weren't sure if that was the right question to ask. So this is a totally judgment-free zone if you want to talk about any of those things, if there's anything that you want to share or discuss. And also if there's something that you use, something that might come to your mind and you want to reach out to me via email, I'm more than happy to talk about it. Vanessa, thank you for asking. You ask about how do you feel about the word explore? I have been using it in my tagline, but now worry it may be problematic. When I think about it, I don't think of explore as problematic. I use explore a lot, and I think that again, it can also depend on sometimes, the word explore by itself, I don't think of it as problematic, but what comes after. So as long as you feel that what you're exploring is something that you have permission to explore, I don't think it's problematic. If you know what I mean. Um, by itself, that word is okay, in my opinion. Said, you're asking me if how and where do I use my travel writing besides travel sites. I am actually a freelance writer. So I am also a travel blogger and a travel photographer. That's how I started, but I am now also a freelance writer. I write on a freelance basis for different publications. I write about travel, food, hotel, people, lifestyle, culture, art, and now even mental health. My work has appeared in Afar magazine, Lonely Planet, National Geographic UK, Insider Travel, Forbes Travel Guide, bunch of different types of publications. I hope that answers your question. Brittany, yeah, I think you do. Okay, you say that you write about a very colonial destination, and you find it hard not to use the word to describe buildings. However, you stay away from combining it with charming. I think that's great. I think it's okay to call architecture as colonial architecture. The issue is, of course, to say that it's a charming colonial architecture, which is something that I have been very guilty of. Again, I was doing more, or as somebody who was learning, I was doing more of what I saw was already being done. I thought maybe that's the way you write about it. And me being Indian from a country that was colonized, I should have known better, right? But I think I was so used to reading certain kind of language in travel magazines that I thought that maybe that's the way you're supposed to write about it, that maybe to the rest of the world, colonial architecture is charming. And now that I think about it, I'm like, there's nothing charming about it. But of course, if it is colonial architecture, you could say colonial architecture, but not to combine it with charming. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk, Vanessa. And if there's anything else that you think of, please reach out to me via email. I'm also always learning. So this is just a very small portion of the things that I've learned over the last few years. And if there's something that I can learn from you, then that would be great. If there's no more questions, then we can end the session now. So I'm going to wait for a few seconds to see if there are any more questions. And I'm very grateful to all of you. I know that this talk was rescheduled, and some of you have actually taken the time to join today. And sorry to everyone who was signed up for the original talk on the 14th, but COVID got me finally. So this is the reason why it took me 2 weeks to recover and have this talk today. So thank you all for being here. And hopefully I'll see you in the wonderful community. Bye, everyone. I think that's it. There's no more questions, and I'll see you around.